Hello, this is Mr. MeowsAlot, and welcome to the Cat House. This week I read Obedience to Authority by Stanley Milgram. Obedience to Authority is a book by social psychologist Stanley Milgram, and it is basically the journal and data used for his experiments on obedience to authority in the 1960s and 70s. These experiments were, for the majority, done at Yale University, but very importantly, they were not done using students. They were done using volunteers from across the city. These experiments are extremely famous. So this is a 1974 book, but you can still buy it today. It has a new foreword by Philip Zimbardo. Zimbardo and Milgram were, so you know what I'm doing down here. Little Gray's getting a belly rub. And so you know my house is cold because it's now winter in Korea, and so I've got my hat on. Philip Zimbardo and Stanley Milgram went to school together, and they're both extremely famous for the experiments they did on authority, obedience, and agency. I know, it's exciting. And so Philip Zimbardo, who does the foreword for this book, he did the Stanford prison experiments. Bye-bye, Gray. I know. You're upsetting. Too loud. The Stanford prison experiments, where he took students and split them randomly into two groups, made half of them guards, half of them prisoners, and it was to be a 3-week sort of experiment on how do these students behave as guards and prisoners, taking on those roles. But it had to be stopped after 1 week because they started to abuse the prisoners, and the prisoners got all depressed, and it was just terrible to see how normal people turn. And soon I'll be reading his book called the Lucifer Effect, all about this way in which we are demons underneath, and only outwardly are portraying ourselves culturally appropriately. But we're looking at Obedience to Authority by Stanley Milgram. Now, unfortunately, Milgram died 10 years after writing this book. He was only 51. And this is a guy that brought up the idea of 6 degrees of separation and a very unusual concept of the Cyrano Effect. You can look into that if you want. But he's most famous for these experiments he did on obedience, where he had the scientist, the question and buzzer person, and the person getting shocked. 3 subjects, okay? 3 participants. Now, only one of them was an actual volunteer, but the volunteer thought there were 2 volunteers, and they were randomly chosen for either who got the shocks and who got to ask the questions. They got to ask the questions. The idea was, with a scientist standing behind you, telling you to continue, would you continue to increase the shock, the electric shocks being given that you're pushing to the person answering your questions if they get them wrong? Then you increase the shock. And the panel that they had was from 15 volts to 450 volts, with 450 volts having X's, and incrementally it would say mild, medium, dangerous, and then X. The person on their side, the person getting the shocks, was in another room. They couldn't really see them. They weren't really getting shocks, but they were actors, and so at certain intervals, always the same, they would start to scream out in panic, saying, "Ow, ow, ow, it hurts," and then another point they'd say, "I have a heart condition," and another point they'd say, I don't want to do this anymore, I want to stop," and then they'd go silent for 10 rounds. They predicted, the scientists, that, well, we're a good culture, no one's going to go to the end and essentially kill these people. But 60% did. Over 60% in some of the cases. Now, if you know this experiment, you're saying, oh, I don't need to read the book. They did 19 experiments. Variations of experiments. Okay, not just 19. 19 variations of experiments. So one variation was just simply they used women instead of men. Okay. But other variations were they had two scientists who would argue about stopping the experiment. Another one is they had several people in charge of the panel of shocking and see how they interacted. But only still, all of them were Confederates except for one was the actual volunteer. Another one, fascinating, was they'd actually have to, instead of having the subject, the victim in the other room, they'd actually have to push their hand down on the shocker, even after they stopped responding, and zap them themselves. And it was very fascinating, particularly back when people were trying to discover why the Nazis had been so willing to do all these atrocities in World War II. And so Hannah Arendt and Milgram and Zimbardo investigated this obedience and like, I'm just doing my job, right? And sort of offloading the responsibility for the atrocities onto someone else. And this is what's happening here, is they discovered it could be in any culture. This could happen, right? Because in us, we have this propensity to obey authority. And it's fascinating. So in the book, he's got all the data and the graphs, and he explains each experiment shift and variation. And he, in fact, every chapter he has a little bit of information about the dialogue that happened. They recorded everything. So if you only know this experiment from the video or film that you watched, and you're like, oh, I know all about that. No. You got to read it. It's fascinating. The little variations they did. They one of the experiments, they took it off campus to say, oh, well, maybe it's because on campus it seems very official and whatever. So they took it off campus. Really interesting, okay? And also interesting is when they disobeyed, because there were certain variations where the obedience dropped dramatically. And it's all about how responsibility is done. When is the topic of disobeying brought up? And also the conclusions that Milgram has at the end of the book, and saying that we are brought up to obey, and through our life is a series of obedience systems that we are in. Like, we obey our family structure, our parents, then we obey our teachers, then we obey our bosses, and it's just this whole continuation of obedience in our lives that we're conditioned to accept. And he explains this as we sort of give over our agency to make things easier in a system, right? So we obey in order to make the system function better. A hierarchy is beneficial. However, it comes to a point, and this is what surprises us so much, it comes to a point where we actually start to obey things that go against our moral nature. Nature? Our nature, it appears, is to obey. We're not naturally moral. It depends on the situation. It's fascinating stuff. I really, really recommend that you read it and that you get more of an indication of how we are as humans in our civilization, how our civilizational system works, how we fit into it, and how we are so susceptible to an agentic state, agency state, as Milgram argues. It's very interesting, a good read. Keep reading. Until next week, take care. From the Cat House, this is Mr. MeowsAlot.